R-B-Y, occasionally D-O-R-B-Y by somebody who was really going by pronunciation. But it was spelled a lot D-A-R-B-Y, which meant that it was pronounced Darby. But current pronunciation, when you speak of Derby Street or the Derby House, is to pronounce it D-E-R-B-Y. So that's why we go back and forth depending on whether we're talking about Elias Haskett Darby or Derby Street. Yes?
How did Elias spell it?
The family spelled it D-E-R-B-Y. So it was spelled, Mr. Haskett spelled it.
The English pronunciation.
It's the English pronunciation. We were still doing that. I mean, it's the same situation that odd Hawthorne boy ran into when he actually officially put a W in his name, because around here with the New England accent, the family name H-A-T-H-O-R-N-E is naturally pronounced Hawthorne. But when he started traveling around and going to other places, I think he was naturally rather shy, and he didn't like to be called attention to by having people going, "Mr. Haythorne, can I help you?" So he changed the spelling of his name.
What about the Crown and Shield name? Or is that pronounced different ways?
That was pronounced very different ways, and part of the issue, of course, is that it's a German name. So we have no idea what to do with it, those of us who have an English background. I would hear it pronounced Crown and Shield, Crown and Shield, Crown and Shield, Crown and Child. It really it depended on who was doing it. And that's one of the things before spelling was standardized by Mr. Webster. People would spell things phonetically very often. So here we are on the later waterfront. Now in our day, this area was just beginning to be developed. This building right here, this brick building, was actually the starter home for Mr. Elias Haskett Darby. This is the wedding present that Captain Richard Darby presented to Mr. Elias Haskett and his wife, Elizabeth, when they got married in 1761. It was finished in 1762, I'm told. I knew it very well because my family were good friends of Mr. Henry Prince, who was the captain for the Darbys, and he actually bought the house from the family in 1800. So we actually got to know him quite well. He was a friend and client of my husband's. Unfortunately, like so many others, he had a great deal of difficulty surviving the economic ups and downs that came around the War of 1812, and he lost the house around 1820, had to sell it off, and actually ended his days as an inspector working for the U.S. Customs House here. Now this building was built in 1819. It was actually a purpose-built customs house built here in 1819, and this tells you something very important about our geography here in Salem, which was that by 1819 this area of the city had become important enough in terms of the trade going in and out, particularly of Derby Wharf, which had been extended to a half mile in around 1804, 1805, that the Customs Service felt that this was a better spot to be centralizing their customs services to people coming in and out, because there were many more. There were over 50 wharves in Salem at the height of the East Indies trade, and so there were several more wharves going down in this direction. Mr. Blaney's Wharf, Mr. Turner's Wharf, the old Turner Wharf that had been there since the 1660s, and then the Crown and Shield or East India Wharf was actually even further out than this. And of course, one of the most famous stories in Salem was the fact that even though Mr. Elias Haskett Darby had married Elizabeth Crown and Shield, and Elias Haskett Darby's sister Mary married Elizabeth Crown and Shield's brother George, so therefore they had a double alliance, Mr. Haskett and Mr. George hated each other. Mr. George had worked for Mr. Darby's father, and I think there was some ill will there about the way he had been treated by Mr. Darby's father, Captain Darby, and so George was an extremely difficult man to get along with. Did you find? I never liked him very much. His wife, Mrs. Crown and Shield, was a lovely, delightful, very cultured, very, very well read, extremely good conversationalist. We all just adored her. And we couldn't understand how she stuck with Mr. George. Of course, the famous dispute here in Salem was between Mr. George Crowninshield and Mr. Elias Haskett Darby, because as both began to extend their wharves into the harbor, they each then began to sue each other because they were claiming that Mr. Darby claimed that Mr. Crownenshield's wharf caused silt to gather around Mr. Darby's wharf, and Mr. Crowninshield claimed that Mr. Darby's construction impeded the flow of water and caused silt to gather around Mr. Crownenshield's wharf. So finally, unfortunately, around 1795, Mr. Darby forced Mr. Crowninshield to shorten the length of his wharf, which made for a great deal of conversation in the taverns about the various lengths of the various wharves belonging to the various merchants in town. So we all had a great deal of fun with that. So this began. That is sort of the root of the division between these two families and how they became the leaders of the Republican and Democratic Republican and Federalist factions in town in the 1790s. It was one of the reasons that the Crowninshields really chose that side of the political spectrum. And in fact, Mr. Benjamin Crowninshield, who built the house right beyond there, was Mr. Madison's Secretary of War at the end of the War of 1812. So that is our express tour of Salem. We moved rather quickly there, I'm afraid. And I'm now going to turn you over to Mrs. Mary Ann Zajewski in real life, who is going to, after a little bit of a break, she is going to take you on board Friendship, which is our tall ship here. It's a full-size, fully operational replica of a vessel that was actually built here in Salem in 1797. It was actually built right where the white buildings stand, the shipyard of Enos Briggs. And Briggs was the premier shipbuilder in Salem at the time. So you'll be finding out a lot more about Friendship and the programs that we do on board her. And you'll also be getting to go into the Custom House before we all meet over in St. Joe's for me to do a little commentary on why we're wearing what we're wearing. So if anybody has any final questions, feel free. I'll be around.
Thank you.
All right.